All right. So welcome to the very last talk of fall 2020's GLODEM Book Club. We have the great pleasure of having Dr. Jack Loveridge, who will speak about their latest book, Yearbook for the History of Global Development with us today. Before I give the floor to Dr. Loveridge, I'd like to briefly introduce our speaker today. Dr. Loveridge is a historian of science and technology and a co-founder of Initiate Digital Rights and Society. He's also a senior researcher at the MA Computational Social Science Lab at Koç University and also GLODEM. His historical research centers on the roles in scientific research, philanthropic investment, and technological change played in shaping development discourse during the 20th century. His scholarly publications have examined the economic and scientific origins of South Asia's Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, framed within the long era of decolonization. Before serving as the Paris Peace Forum's senior policy advisor on algorithmic governance issues from 2021 to 2022, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs during 2018-19, and also lectured at the Cooper Union between 2017-18. He also held a dissertation fellowship at Yale's International Security Studies program between 2016-17, and also a Fulbright narrow doctoral research fellowship at the University of Delhi between 2014 and 15. He completed his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin in 2017, and he holds an MPhil in International Development from University of Oxford. Well, without further ado, I'll turn back to Dr. Loveridge. Thank you so much for being with us today. So can you tell us a little bit about the book as a debut of the book to our attendees?
Absolutely. And on the contrary, thank you and thank GLODEM so much for having me speak today. It's a real pleasure to be able to get the word out about this new volume. It's an edited volume just released by DeGruyter, Oldenburg, and I'm a co-editor of it. So I'm one of 4 co-editors, the others being Iris Bari from Shanghai University, Nicholas Ferns from Monash University in Australia, and Karina Unger from the European University Institute in Florence. So it's going to be a running series, and we've already got 2 more coming down the pipe. But the first one is an introductory volume that sets the terms for the discussion. And we hope that it'll be a book that leading historians, leading experts in international development can contribute to over the coming years. As a yearbook, it'll be an annual publication, global in scope, hopefully with a great deal of representation from the global South. And we were very pleased, especially to have a number of really top-notch historians of international development agree to contribute to the first edition. The first edition is divided into 2 parts, one that sets the stage, setting up the discourse, understanding what the terms mean, defining development, and framing it within a longer history. So we all know the World Bank, the IMF, the alphabet soup of acronyms that lead development as we know it today. From the level of high finance on down to the various programs that operate within countries that have been, for one reason or another, defined as developing over the years. But what we seek to do is situate that in the longer trajectory of international history, going back to the period of colonialism, going back to the Enlightenment, incorporating all of the discussions that occurred in the contentious debates of the 19th and 20th centuries on up to the First World War and the Great Depression, the Second World War, and then of course the Cold War. So we have to keep that context in mind. And that's what the first part of this first volume establishes. What are the major debates? What is the historical context? How does this connect to colonialism, to European empire around the world, how does development also connect to decolonization, more importantly, after the Second World War? The second part of the volume, the one that I most intensely edited, focuses on quantification within the practice of development. Again, branching on back into the 19th century. So looking at that conception of development that was held by imperial and colonial officials, primarily within the British and French empires, but also looking at American imperialism and trying to define why it was that quantification took off in ways that it did. Why counting not just people, but crops, but environmental impact, why that became what it became over the roughly 2 centuries that we're interested in. And that's basically how we laid out the book. And, again, we're just very grateful to have a dozen or so really excellent historians who have contributed to this volume. And it's just been a delight to go through all of their work, ranging from environmental history to history of medicine, to just standard fare international history, economic history. So it's a very great mix of different perspectives on the question of what is development and how has quantification, how have numerical systems come into play within that economic history. So that's the basic intro, and I'm happy to dig a little further into any of the debates or concepts that might come our way.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's actually a great way to, I guess, kick off the book talk, because I was also going to ask how you define development because as we all know, every discipline has its own conceptualization in a way, but also speaking of all these branches of history, economic history or environmental history and all, and writing an edited volume together, bringing people together, did you have any difficulties in having these definitions redefined in some cases, maybe?
Of course, there's always a little bit of contention, and within this field, there's a tremendous bit of contention. And as historians, we have to be as careful as possible not to project back the way we think about development. So the definition of development that's commonplace, that we recognize in an edition of Foreign Affairs or in Foreign Policy in The Economist, that's something that we can't assume is the common definition across the several centuries that we're working with. A couple of the pieces go as far back as Imperial China. So we're talking about a great span of history and looking at how institutions, I should say, over time have conceptualized material progress. And so that's perhaps the best way to define it, is looking at how institutions and individuals have defined material progress. And so that becomes something that's relational and comparative. And it's something that occurs over time. Now, the term development is used haphazardly by imperial officials through the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's not really hammered out to what we know as international development until the end of the Second World War, when all of the great Bretton Woods institutions are set up, when we get the World Health Organization and all of the agencies of the United Nations. That's when a definition of it that we can recognize comes into play. But that definition itself is highly relational. So it's about comparing not just societies, but areas within societies. How is one town doing compared to another in terms of that material progress broadly defined? So we like to keep it as wide as possible. And I just wanted to bring in another book that I happen to have. I found this in a bookshop in London. I don't know if it's backwards, but it's about backward people as defined by the British colonial officials in the 1920s and 30s, modern production among—
We can't read it, yeah, it's not flipped, yeah. Thank you.
But it's kind of nice to bring that concept in, because there was this thinking, and this is produced by the London School of Economics in 1930. There was this thinking that there is such a thing as a backward society. And these societies need to be corrected and put on the right trajectory. That is very much nested within colonial thought. And that comes into play, particularly within the British administration and in my work of India, where you're thinking of, you as a colonial official, I should say, not you directly, are thinking of the people that you're governing as in need of correction. So that's implicit within earlier definitions of development. And some of that thought does carry on over into the post-war period. It's not a firm break with the past at all. And that's something that we have to keep in mind as historians, is what informs contemporary discourse without projecting the contemporary definitions back too far. So it's about material welfare, it's about human well-being, and always in a comparative sense. And just one more word about that, modern production among backward peoples. That is basically the way it was seen as by colonial officials of the French and British empires, and probably also of the Ottoman Empire, although I have less historical context for it, is this idea that there's a center that has reached a certain state of material progress, and the periphery must be brought along one way or another. And that production is essential to sustaining the metropolis and making sure that the metropolis is healthy and living well and reaching that state of material progress that it sees as necessary. So that's basically the definition we use, as broad as possible to bring in as many perspectives as possible without running the risk of casting back contemporary thought into the past, which would kind of make the whole process of doing history bunk. So we have to be careful with that.
And I mean, thinking of the progress, I mean, what could we say about the more recent, or we could say, developments in the international development arena, such as the SDGs, the earlier Millennium Development Goals? In a way, maybe it's also the reflection of there is a certain way to develop. You need to follow the steps towards this and that, and quantifying these. Do you see any similarities? I mean, because for, of course, historians, perspective, I mean, coming from a historical perspective, you may see other nuances that we may be overlooking.
Sure. I mean, one great thing about the book, again, is that the final section of it, I said there were two sections. There's actually three. The third one is dedicated to alternative development indices. So how do we measure development in the contemporary period, and how does that connect back to that? So that's a great question, because there is a discussion in there about the SDGs. There is a discussion in there as well about that period where we were concerned with a happiness index, and countries like Bhutan took off with that and have made that something that's very useful for them. And then looking at human development in a multidimensional sort of holistic way, which when I was doing my graduate degree at Oxford, that was something that was really taking off, looking at the multidimensional aspects of it. So you can place that into a longer context, but basically the similarities are, they're heavily quantified. We're working with numbers. We're dealing with the environment. We're dealing with health outcomes. So the sort of palette is similar, but I think the brushstrokes and the resulting painting look very different. The concerns are more multifaceted today, although they are still dominated by high finance and concerns about gross national product, for instance, or gross domestic product, however we want to define it. And there's a great discussion within the volume about that, taking some of the work by J.R. McNeill, another historian, a very famous historian of science and technology, who argues basically that thinking about growth, the idea of growth as the end of development, is one of the most profound thoughts, or the profound turns of the 20th century, where we have this very growth-intensive, growth-focused regime in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that is less concerned with equality, that is less concerned with inequality for sure, and is more concerned with raising GNP or GDP, whatever the case may be, and certainly raising planetary output. So you still have that balance between output and its negative externalities. So creating more stuff, distributing that stuff, and how evenly it's distributed, that is still fundamental to more contemporary conceptions of development. However au courant they may seem, they still have that inside of them. And that's what's very interesting about this historical discussion, is you can find that original kernel of, which explains why it is people are concerned with these material questions in the first place. And the sun's coming up, so I'm just going to close my shades.
Absolutely.
I'll move a bit.
And thank you so much for joining this book talk that is actually quite early in the morning, by the way, for those of you who are with us today. It's really convenient for us, but not so much for those who live in Texas, I suppose.
No problem at all.
Thank you so much. My other questions then is going to be about, as you also mentioned, the science and technology aspect of it. Looking at the chapters covered in the book, and I haven't had a chance to go over them, but hopefully we'll do that soon. Do you see any differences in, regionally speaking, the same areas, the kind of development that countries pursued with similar growth levels? That's probably referring to the Asian kind of development versus the so-called Western development strategies. Even back in the 20th century, we had the so-called Asian tigers who were growing immensely with the help of their export-oriented strategies. But then things are changing, of course, with the pandemic nowadays. So everyone's questioning whether this is a sustainable policy they have, or whether the West can continue growing, because we're reaching also, it's kind of a plateauing at this point for some countries in the European Union, for example. So, again, coming from a historical perspective, you are much better in seeing the booms and busts, the cycles, and I suppose we are approaching maybe the end of one. Did you have any chapters particularly focusing on this, or maybe your general idea of what we have in store after in the post-pandemic world? Assuming the pandemic is over, obviously it's a little bit optimistic to say that maybe for now, but
absolutely. Historians are probably the least eager to predict the future, or to cast their findings into the future, and perhaps they're some of the best prepared people to do so. So it's kind of a sad thing in a sense, because you have so many historians who are well informed and know what long periods of time portend, for institutions and for ideas, how ideas kind of decay, and understanding that there are hype cycles. And I know there are plenty of development experts who would bristle at that, to think that something like, and I as much as I agree with the objectives and the areas of focus of the SDGs, there is a sort of hype to them. And that's something that is important to know and remember when we're trying to accomplish real material objectives, because we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about outcomes over a long period of time. So it's important, to make sure that there's actual impact, that these ideas aren't just things that are being repeated because they're something that's been published, and I've been beating up on The Economist, published in The Economist recently. So we have to be careful with that. And yes, absolutely. You can look at Latin America through the 1970s and 80s. You can think about import substitution. You can think about various regimes of liberalization then that followed. And so much of development discourse rests on promise, on what this is going to do for the small farmer, for the individual who's moved to a city and is looking for a job and can't find it. What does development mean for them? And what does development mean for the future of an entire nation? So there is that risk of regional priorities blending together with something along the lines of a global hype that means that outcomes might be a little muddled. Outcomes might be hard to quantify over time. And then there's the inevitable backlash against liberalization, of course. I think back to something in my earlier memory reminds me of Seattle in the late 1990s, concerns over the WTO and protests regarding that. Protests regarding NAFTA here in the United States and in North America more generally. So liberalization has proven has demonstrated its limits, has shown that there are plenty of negative externalities to that regime. And what comes next is hopefully something that is more considerate of the disparities that it generates within countries and the sort of migration flows that are inevitable when people are told there are no jobs here, there's no work here anymore, there's no remunerative existence left here in the countryside, time to go to the cities, and you get to a city and there's no work there, time to go to another country. That acceptance of the fluidity of capital, which seems to be this borderless entity, really doesn't gel well with borders and barriers for labor. Labor is stuck in the current conceptualization of it. Labor in the current international system is something that is fixed in place, more or less, in spite of all the migration that we have. And I suppose this is top of mind right now for me, because being here on the border, we are dealing with the humanitarian effects of what you might consider failed or limited development policies further south in this hemisphere. And our country has played its own role in those policies. So
we can relate to that too, with Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. It's just seemingly this is a global thing, and that's what's intriguing about it right now is this migration that is a result of various cascading crises coupled with institutional failures. And the people who represent those institutions will argue this, 3 ways to Sunday, or however you say it. they'll argue it, and we won't get to any kind of firm conclusion. But it is seemingly, demonstrative of a big problem within how we think of international development. So, but I'm just a historian, so I don't get too far.
No, I mean, that's all. It is in a way surprising that we keep saying that like history tends to repeat itself, but and that actually gives us a lot of material to speculate on, of course. But historians are the last ones to speculate about like the future. Probably economists and then political scientists are more guilty of that.
Be careful, I guess.
yes, and now we have other if we consider it as a game, other actors in the game. Now we have the AI to predict the future as well, so with machine learning and all. But, again, guilty of that here. We do that in our lab, as you know, but hopefully for more innocent purposes.
Altruistic, for sure.
Yes, I would say that. But maybe just connecting that to, as I just mentioned, AI, because one of the things that was really striking to us in one of the projects that we started at MACSSL is looking at the national AI strategies of about 50 countries actually now. They're officially published. There is only a few instances where equality is actually mentioned. It's mostly focusing on all these documentation that we used AI to read, but it's telling us that, I mean, the pattern is telling us that it's mostly more technical terms, either that focuses on military security nexus of the story, and not so much about human development. So whether we're really learning from our mistakes in the past was going to be the next question. I mean, apart from the usual suspects in the Scandinavian countries that are doing a better job.
Well, I mean, I think what's useful in that context is to think about how the Cold War, after the First World War and through nearly to the end of the 20th century, affected development discourse, and how what would seemingly be innocent humanitarian priorities all had a heavy geopolitical concern within them. They weren't developed by individuals who were immune to that geopolitical discourse, concerns over one, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, that ideological competition that was also a very clearly military competition, to population growth of the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, this concern over what was called then a population bomb. And that was something that was the title of a book by Paul Ehrlich in 1968. That became, again, a general concern of international development. How can we even hope to keep up with growing populations from an economic standpoint if we don't implement a regime of population control around the world? And then into that comes later a concern over environmental repercussions. Not to say that the two are necessarily connected, but you have Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and then in the 1970s, here in this country, the emergence of the EPA, just a more general concern over the long-term effects of growth for the natural environment. So those three concerns, whether you agree or disagree with them from an ideological standpoint, I think demonstrate how development policy, sorry, I got a phone call. Development policy can be shaped by these political interests of the time, of the day. So once the Cold War ends in the late 80s and early 90s, you would expect then that this depoliticized international development regime would solve a whole host of problems. But into that vacuum entered other political debates, other geopolitical concerns, other dynamics between what became a unipolar world that seemed to have sort of clouded the agenda on some level. And so, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it does help to sort of set out how over time, more pressing concerns seem to get in the way of what should ultimately, I think, be a humanitarian process, a humanitarian impetus. And so that inequity or equity seemed to be left out, just showed, I think, how that's kind of playing a backseat role to other concerns when you have an international development scheme that is basically dominated by nation states. And that's something that, within the book itself, I think the contributors show that that's something that's newish. That's not, that hasn't been there forever. The nation state, of course, being something that's popularized after the First World War and then really comes into a whole international system apparatus after the Second World War. That's something that definitely affects how development policies are formulated. I mean, they really, really do rely on that international system, and any threats or changes to that international system can upend tons of development funding, can shift the discourse, can change priorities. So that system is now the bedrock upon which development is based.
So thinking of the audience that the book is written for, maybe, would you say it could be used as a textbook for international development related courses? Who could read and learn a lot from this book, if you will?
I think that it could. I think that this volume could be used as an introductory text. Moving forward, they will be thematic in nature. So the next volume will be focused on health. The subsequent one after that will look at institutions of development. So going down the list, again, that old alphabet soup I discussed, and some of the older institutions related to the League of Nations and preceding international institutions that we don't think about anymore, but that played a role in defining that discourse. I think it could be used and should be used in classes, in courses at the undergraduate level all around the world, because it is accessible and each of the articles provide a great look into a broader historiography. So they're launching off points for both historians and development professionals. And I think that any development professional would benefit greatly from having this as a background resource. We in history always lament how policymakers seem to ignore the work, or don't even know about the work, or don't even know about past time beyond their immediate experience, which is cool. That's okay. I understand the complexities of working in that field. However, if you read one of these articles a night or one a week, you would come away with a much better rounded perspective on the field in which you work as a policymaker. And you'd understand how previous policymakers framed problems, how they thought about them, where they succeeded, and I think just as importantly, where they failed, where they fell short, and how we can all get caught up in a way of thinking about the world that locks us in a sense, that doesn't allow us to say, all of these institutions, for better or worse, were created at one point in time. They're changeable. Although as institutions age, they have a kind of a heyday where they seem to be impenetrable, invulnerable, and then all of a sudden gone because material realities have changed significantly. Yeah. And I think to some extent, a lot of historians of science and medicine in particular were fairly well prepared for the COVID-19 crisis. So being a historian, I think, really does help you, and having that historiography, the knowledge of the historiography, does help you prepare for what's coming next, does help you imagine outcomes that people who are simply following the news might not be able to conceptualize. And so I just encourage anybody who's watching this to pick up a book, a history book, and support our suffering profession. So that's the rattling the can moment. Can rattled, check.
I actually asked this because I am lecturing an international development course in spring, and it's actually called Survival and Prosperity in an Interdependent World. It has a fancy name. It's one of the mandatory courses of the Global Leadership Program here at Koç University, and I actually have been looking for a book that would actually teach our students at an undergraduate level. The course is, of course, coming from different disciplines. We have students from engineering, from the med school, from law, from all faculties really, who are taking this course. And we usually have the issue of finding an international development course that gives the basics without necessarily expecting the student to know have any prior knowledge on the economics related issues in international development. Most of the books that the textbook types, at least, I could say, are heavily actually focusing on the economic growth aspect of it to start with. And that's something that is not, it doesn't come that natural to undergraduate students necessarily. I mean, especially when they're coming from other disciplines. And so I always tell that we actually first need to go over the history of it, how it all started, how it evolved over time. But we fall short of, in a way, sources that we can cite sometimes that are easy to read for undergraduate students as well, which is why I selfishly asked if it could be used as a textbook. And I will definitely assign that as a reading for my students now that I know that it can be actually easily read and understood the undergraduate level.
Absolutely. And it's open access, I should say. It was a high priority on the part of the 4 editors, was to make sure that everybody, anywhere in the world could get it. And so you can download it right now if you like.
Okay.
You can pay $60 US and again, throw a little bit of money into the can.
No, but that's, I mean, I'm really glad to hear it's open access. I mean, with the depreciation of Turkish lira, it's really actually quite expensive for students sometimes to purchase textbooks. So that's why I shy away from assigning textbooks for courses, but then it's really not so easy to, follow the class when you don't have a book that you can use to follow the discussions in the class. So thank you so much, Jack, for putting this together. I mean, thank you and the other editors, of course, and all the authors of the book for all the hard work you put onto this. I really look forward to reading it, actually. Before we close, I would like to briefly open the floor for a Q&A session. And turn to our audience if they'd like to ask any questions to Dr. Loveridge. We can wait for a few minutes. You can also put your questions in the chat box if you want. I'm not sure if you allowed unmuting feature here. The webinar structure is a little different than I'm not just so used to it, actually. We usually just do the regular meetings, but I think everyone's still able to, just raise your hand if you have any questions.
And happy to answer any question about anything at all, really.
Any questions about anything at all from the audience? About Texas, maybe? Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, if they have any questions, obviously, also people who are listening to the recording of this session, you can always feel free to email Dr. Loveridge, I suppose, regarding questions about the book, and can be easily Google his name and last name, and the book is right here. It's open access. I invite everyone to. Okay, yeah, I'll just read it out loud because again, those who are listening to the recording on YouTube wouldn't be able to read them, I suppose. It's a question from Alia. You briefly mentioned how much of development discourse is still linked to modernity discourse of the 1960s, but I was wondering if there are other historical discourses that can also be linked to today's development discourse. Are there any other discourses it can be linked to? Thank you very much, Alia. We'll just answer that alive.
Absolutely. One of the aspects of the volume that we explore is how the Soviet Union, for instance, perceived development, which is a kind of riff off of a modernization, but it's not grounded in the Walter Rostow thinking. It's not grounded in the World Bank. It does have a component of it that's focused on inequality and a concern over that, at least on paper. Now, in practice, the results are somewhat different and debatable, but that is something that I think you can track back to the debates of the middle of the 20th century over that contentious battle between capital and labor and the role that the state might play if the state is run with an eye toward equality. So that equity component is certainly there. Going back a bit further, one of the very interesting articles in the book in the first half is by Frederick Cooper, a very well-written professor of history in New York, who is looking at that remaking, that refashioning of the imperial world order. And so some of the discussions that he gets into are how development of the post-war period was something of a break from a more agricultural view of what development represented, going back to counting crops, going back to thinking about the productivity of land, where so much of this is rooted. So that idea of the sort of productive capacity of the earth itself, that has deeper roots. That goes much further back. And when it comes to the quantification side of things, the roots extend on back toward the physiocrats of late 18th century France. And so there are all of these different ideas that are grounded in much earlier periods of history that you can see playing out in conversation with modernization theory, and also doing battle with that. So the SDGs, for instance, are not 100% part and parcel grounded in modernization. You have these other intellectual debates that certainly contribute to these priorities that we're currently looking at. So I hope that begins to address the question. I can't address it as well as the many historians in the book could, so I encourage anybody who has further questions to download the book. And I mentioned something about historians being able to predict the future, but this historian wasn't able to predict the rising of the sun. So take that with a grain of salt, and sorry about this strange light show you got here from the West Texas desert, but
not at all. Thank you so very much for sparing time to us today, despite being really early in the morning in Texas.
No problem.
And
I
with
really
that,
appreciate
again,
the opportunity.
I was going to say, I invite everyone to get their open access copies or hard copies as well. Some people actually like reading hard copies, like myself. With that, we'll close the GLODEM Book Club of Fall 2022, and we'll hopefully see you all next term again with brand new book talks. Thank you again very much, Jack, for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank
I'll
you.
pause recording now.